All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our next presentation for the U.S. Society of uh, for U.S. Society for Ecological Economics. This is, I believe, our third seminar on our Honorary Fellows program. Today we will be learning about Herman Daly from Josh Farley. But before we get into that, hopefully you all received an email regarding some of our next events. On Tuesday the 23rd, we will have our second book club, which have turned out to be quite interesting. This will only be our second one, but we welcome you to participate in that. And then on May 3rd, we will have a presentation by David Murphy from St. Lawrence University. And then on the 17th from one of the originators, Corinne Limburg. So please look for those and hopefully you'll be able to attend and participate. So today's presentation is by Joshua Farley. He's obviously an ecological economist, and he's the professor in community development and applied economics and public administration, as well as a fellow in the Gund Institute for the Environment at the University of Vermont. He is the past president of the ISEE and is well known in ecological economic circles, has published extensively in that area. And he is the co-author, along with our honoree today, Herman Daly, of Ecological Economics, Principles and Applications, published by Island Press. It's a good book. I would recommend that you get it. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Josh. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, John. As I was saying a little bit earlier, it's kind of tough to give a talk on Herman Daly because he's so well known and was so influential in ecological economics that I'm a little concerned I'm just going to be saying things that people know, but I want to go a little bit beyond that and put him in the context of his times. And I'll talk also some about his influence with me and some of the controversies that currently surround him a little bit. He was hugely influential in my academic career. I'd probably be an unknown to this day if he hadn't kind of taken me under his wing and invited me to co-author that book with him. And I have to say he was, just one of the best people you could ever collaborate with. He was so respectful and, in a position in my career where he had no need to be respectful. But I want to start out basically with, if I can make this thing go. Yeah. Oops. With my introductions to Herman Daly, and I'm putting this in plural. And this is a little bit of a story of my own path in ecological economics. But I had done a master's degree in international development and seen how much harm international development people could do. So I decided to go get a PhD to learn more, and hopefully then if I went into the field of international development to do less harm. And my favorite professor told me I should study economics, and that's where I would learn the most. It was the most applied. But within my first semester of my PhD, I realized that mainstream economics was based on bad science and worse ethics. And I would have quit the program, but I got a fellowship to go spend a year in Brazil, explicitly not to study ecological economics. And when I was telling my folks about my frustration with mainstream economics, they gave me Herman's book For the Common Good with John Cobb. And I read that. I went to Brazil. It turned out the university I was at, the president of the university, Cristóvão Buarque, was a big fan of Herman's and, told me about ecological economics and kind of pushed me to learn more. So I spent that year really studying ecological economics, reading Herman's work, reading Roygan, reading a lot of the leaders in the field, and just blew my mind and said, I want to be an economist. I went from ready to abandon the field to wanting to be an economist, and went back really excited, talked to my committee, and they told me, well, that's just all garbage. And, you can't work on ecological economics. You have to work on what we believe, not what you believe. And I say this partly to show that this is what Herman had to deal with his entire career. He really was presenting radical ideas. He was really trying to change a field. But anyway, so I was back. They told me I had to write, what they believe. So I wrote to Herman. Is a totally unknown grad student. and said, I explained to my dilemma. I said, I really want to be an ecological economist. I can't stand this neoclassical. How do I go about becoming an ecological economist? And he said, finish your degree and call yourself one, which is exactly what I did. So I finished my degree, and I would not have finished it without him. And it just made me realize that, how important, how challenging it was for him to be fighting against these systems this was 30 years after Herman had, written some of his breakthrough works, and he was still routinely rejected. And it's interesting that I did my PhD probably at the height of neoliberal economics. So Herman's, one of his early works was 1968, Economics as a Life Science. And this was just when basically neoliberalism was about to take off, with Milton Friedman's early famous 1970 newspaper article in the New York Times saying that the business should only focus on making profits for its shareholders, should never think about nature or the common good. So a real so throughout Herman's career, he was watching neoliberal economics become stronger and stronger. And so I say my introductions to Herman because first my parents gave me a book on him. I read that. Then in Brazil, I was exposed to much more. And then wrote that letter to him. And then finally, years later, I had the chance to meet him. And we hit it off great. And he was just an absolutely wonderful person. And after some conversations, he invited me to write this book with him, the textbook. But so that's just a brief introduction. And now I want to go on to some of his real contributions. So Herman, I think we kind of take for granted what he did. And we've seen his ideas for so long. We just, okay, this is ecological economics, of course. But when he started, he really was fundamentally trying to change the way economists view the world. I mean, he talks a lot about changing a paradigm, changing the basic pre-analytic vision we have before we start to do any economics. And I'm going to go over some of the ways he changed the paradigm. And I'm going to put this in the framework of Donella Meadows, whose work on complex systems says the most powerful levers we have to change complex systems are to change the paradigm and to change the goals. So these are the 2 points I want to focus on with Herman's work. And everybody knows, this idea about changing the biophysical paradigm, mainstream economics. The basic idea is continuous growth. We want the economy to grow at about 3% per year indefinitely, doubling in size every 24 years or so. This means there is no container in which the economy exists. If it can expand indefinitely forever, it's got to be the whole, not the part. And explicitly, I was studying environmental economics, and we were told the goal of environmental economics that our economic activities have negative impacts called negative externalities. The goal is to internalize the negative externalities into the economy. We want to internalize all of nature into the economy, create price signals so that the market mechanism can create this welfare maximizing equilibrium encompassing all of nature and all of the economy. And it's a fantastically unscientific worldview because obviously, and this was Herman's huge contribution, moving from that wildly unscientific view to understanding that the economy is contained within the finite planet. All matter and energy has to come from that finite planet. The raw materials we convert into economic products alternatively serve as the structural building blocks of ecosystems. The energy we burn is primarily fossil fuels. When we convert that raw material to economic products, it returns to nature as waste. The energy we use to create those economic products return to nature as waste, and in the process degrade those ecosystems. And ecosystems provide these life support functions that all species need for their survival. So in the process of converting nature into the economy, we get a flow of economic services, but we sacrifice some flow of ecosystem services. And as the economy over the last 100 years has, increased 35 times in size and the resource throughput into the, from nature back to nature as waste, the economy hasn't grown into a void. It's grown into a finite ecosystem and has done immense damage to that ecosystem, which we are now incredibly aware of. But to put this in context, Herman was starting to write about this in the late 60s, early 70s. The human population has doubled since then. Per capita consumption has more than doubled since then. Our economy is just vastly larger. And, now we put these ideas forth and it's easier to see. Herman was doing this, based on solid theory before we could see all these profound impacts, trying to make that case through his brilliant arguments and his incredibly clear vision. When I first read Herman's work, I thought this is so obviously the way the real world works. It's so obviously based in science that within a very short time, this will be the paradigm. This is the way everybody is going to think about it. And I get back and find out that no, that's not true at all. And in fact, my committee basically told me if I pursued ecological economics, I'd never get a job or a publication, and I was wasting my time. My view, though, is if I pursued their view of reality, any job I got, I would hate, and I wouldn't think well of myself. So I fortunately did stick to Herman's. But these were the first ideas that captured me, this biophysical paradigm. And as part of this, in his first work in 1968, he points out that both life and economy are far from equilibrium thermodynamic systems that feed on low entropy from the environment. So just as I consume food and excrete waste, our economy has a social metabolism that consumes enormous amounts of energy and raw materials and excretes waste. And, as Herman said, the purpose, the value produced to the metabolic process is the maintenance of life. And the purpose, the value produced to the economic process is the maintenance and enjoyment of life. And in either process, the only material output is waste. And so this is really, really important to think of the economy in that way. And in this same article, Herman talked about our endosomatic organs, our livers, our kidneys, the things we have within us that allow us to function, and our exosomatic organs, cars, planes, houses, things that other species create biologically typically, and we are able to build and create, and they take energy and raw materials throughput to maintain. And this picture of the gorilla here is just based on the work of my friend Nate Hagans, who points out that if we account for all the energy we burn with our exosomatic organs, each one of the 8 billion humans has the metabolism of a 30-ton primate. We consume so many resources. And, so Herman really brought these ideas out. And, whereas mainstream economics was based on equilibrium, he's talking about far from equilibrium. And mainstream economics never talks about the production of waste or the raw material inputs. These are the ideas that Herman was pulling out in 1968, fundamentally trying to change the paradigm. And lately there's been a lot of talk about this problem with Cartesian dualism, seeing humans as separate from nature. And we need to recognize that we are part of the natural system, unavoidably so. And, so these are ideas, this humans are apart from and superior to nature. It's been around for hundreds of years. So Herman wasn't just challenging modern economics. Herman was challenging the Western worldview. And this is not a quote by Herman, but he quoted it in his paper, 1968 paper on economics as a life science. This is the economy of nature and ecology of man are inseparable, and attempts to separate them are more than misleading. They are dangerous. So already he was trying to get rid of this Cartesian dualism, recognizing humans as part of the natural system and subject to the same laws of nature as natural systems. So we are evolutionary beings. We live in an evolutionary economy. And this is a quote from Herman, because lately I've gotten very, very interested in biological and cultural evolution. And I look back to a 1968 paper and see that Herman, foreshadowed my career even now. And he says, in biological evolution, genes transmit the knowledge of organic forms over time, and gene mutations introduce occasional modifications, resulting in the success of the forms best suited to the environment. In economic evolution, culture transmit knowledge over time. And new ideas produce mutant organizations from which competition again determines the fittest. And I'll get back to these ideas because they're very much related to my current research. But I find it very interesting that he was talking about this in 1968. He also has a sentence from this paper. He says, a natural history of economic evolution might be built around the theme of economic surplus. And actually, I can't even read the bottom of my thing. And it's progressive growth and cultivation. So again, here we are. Herman is saying we should look at the history of the economy is one of economic surplus. And interestingly, this is what John Gowdy and Lissy Krall are doing right now. They're really looking, a history of economic evolution through this lens that Herman proposed way back in 1968. I also think what was really, really important is Herman changed the paradigm in terms of the unit of analysis. So mainstream economics is based on methodological individualism, where what we look at, the unit of analysis, is the individual. And society is just the, accumulation of individual activity. There's no emergent properties. There's no social features. Really, we just want to look at the individual. And if you look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy under methodological individualism, it says that mainstream economics is the discipline that most applies this. And it has this bizarre view of humans as, I'm forgetting his name right now. The very famous institutional economist at the turn of the century who coined the phrase neoclassical economics. But he said, that we're homogeneous globules of desire. All we do is want things. Work is a burden. We just want to consume. We want more wealth. We make rational decisions for ourselves, and our utility is not even affected by how well off others are. This is a bizarrely perverse view of human nature. And Herman said, no, we are people in community. We are so connected with each other, we can't survive apart from society. It's the only way we can survive, and we can't look at, it makes no sense to focus on the individual, but we must focus on society. And as I always point out that, what you had for breakfast today, if you think about how many people were required to produce that food, package it, transport it, get it on your plate, that's an enormous number of people. But if you think about the collective knowledge required to do that, to breed the plants, to understand soils, to understand metallurgy so we can build the tractors, to think about internal combustion engines, the knowledge required to do that was produced by billions of people over thousands of years. We are so interdependent on each other. We can't eat breakfast. We can't meet our most basic needs except as part of a community. And I think that's also one of the biggest points Herman made. We have to focus on humans as a social being, as a collective group who cares deeply about each other. So I think that's very important. He also focused on changing the methods of economics. So mainstream economics is just mathematically based. It's almost all math. I remember after doing my, math, the thing about math is, if you have a mathematical equation, it's going to get the same results for everybody. The outcomes are embedded in the equation. It's a tautological system. There's no capacity for evolutionary change. It's all embedded there. The economy itself is clearly changing all the time. We don't have, more buggy whips now. We have cars instead of buggy whips. This just shows how the evolution of agriculture, it's just a qualitative change, not quantitative change. You can't model quantitative change. You can't model qualitative change through mathematics. And this is something that Herman got from his committee. His mentor, basically, is Georges Guroian, who said, that mathematics is like, that economics is based on analytical similes using mathematics. but it's got to address the dialectic reality of fuzzy changes over time. And, in evolution, there was never, some offspring said, oh, my parents were Homo erectus, but I'm Homo sapiens. That's not the way evolutionary change works. That's not the way economic change works. It's a gradual change from A to B in this penumbra where it's both. Herman recognized that. And I also remember when I was doing my PhD, about the time, when I was discovering Herman's work, I learned the math and I did very well on my comps. And my chair said, congratulations, you did really well. And I said, nobody actually believes this shit though, do they? And when I saw his face, I realized, I think I might be in the wrong field. But fortunately, I did discover Herman. And as Herman says, though, in the short run, we can have a steady state. We can have equilibrium. And like within a species, within a human, in the short run, I'm in homeostasis. Our species over time, though, evolves. And so he recognizes that we can focus on, steady states in the short run, but over time, the system is characterized by evolution. And and that's the way the system works. And this was a very big change. So banning the mathematics. I remember when Herman and I first published our book, we got a lot of email from other economists who were saying this isn't economics, and we'd write back say, what do you mean it's not economics? They said there's no math. And I remember saying, that the method of math had come to, rather than being a tool of the discipline, it had come to drive the discipline. And that was inappropriate. And he sent me like 5 articles from econ journals that didn't use math out of the thousands available. So I thought that was kind of funny. And one thing I do want to say too is that Herman, he was building these ideas as the neoliberal revolution was, kind of coming into fruition. But he was publishing in many, many kind of mainstream journals. He was such a good writer, such a master of metaphor, that he got his work accepted even by these, mainstream journals, really got it out there. I'm not sure that would be possible anymore. I think that economics has become more fossilized in its worldview, even though the economy is changing. This is something I often point out, is that I was a biology undergrad, and the things I learned as an undergrad, like the central dogma of cell biology, that one gene codes for one protein in a one-directional flow, that's been shattered now. There's so many new ideas in biology, even though the actual principles of biology, the real physical principles, aren't changing. Our understanding of them is. And in contrast, the core of mainstream economics, which this depicts here, the general Walrasian equilibrium model, comes from the 1870s. Our economy has evolved tremendously since then, but our theories have not. So, just to show again how hard it is to change the paradigm in the field of economics, and the success I think Herman has had. I think all of us here are a testament to his success. And the other thing that's really interesting is, in the first class I ever took in economics, an intro class, the professor said, he starts out the class with marginal, marginal, marginal. It's all about marginal analysis. And he would say that, if you don't know what the answer to a problem is, it's probably marginal cost equals marginal benefit. And in Herman's 1968 article, this is a quote. He says, insofar as economics concentrates on value in exchange, marginal utility, to the exclusion of value in use, total utility, to that extent, it is concerning itself with only an infinitesimal portion of total life value. So he here was rejecting, he would use marginal analysis and he would use it appropriately, but he rejected it as the sole framework. He was far more interested, in the value in use. And the classic example of this is, Nobel laureate Thomas Schelling, I think in 2007, said that climate change doesn't really much matter because it only affects agriculture, and agriculture accounts for less than 1% of our GDP. He says, if we lose 30% of agriculture, we could achieve in 2051 the GDP we otherwise would have achieved in 2050. So he's basically saying we can dismiss agriculture, dismiss climate change because it only affects agriculture. And Herman would point out, and he did point this out in an article in Ecological Economics called "Why Smart People Say Dumb Things," that value and use is the most important, and the use value of food is immeasurable. The use value of a stable climate is immeasurable. So Herman was really challenging the sacred cows of mainstream economics. These are some of the paradigm, just a few of the paradigm changes he made. And I think they're profound. I think they're underappreciated as to how radical they were. But now I want to move on to his efforts to change the goals. And again, I apologize if this is too redundant, if you all know this already so well. But, this from 1960 on, growth has become the driving goal of most economies around the world, regardless of whether they're socialist, communist, capitalist. It has been growth is the goal. Herman rejected this entirely. So growth was the goal. The other element about economics, which is kind of paradigmatic, is that mainstream economists say they are an objective, value neutral science. And, way back to David Hume, who said, there's is what, we can study what is, and we can study what ought to be, and we can't derive one from the other. And economists and scientists wanted to focus on what is. They said that they were viewing the world and trying to, based on their observations, develop hypotheses about how it worked, then test those hypotheses, and eventually they would become theories, but the goal was to understand what is. Whereas Herman was very explicit. He says, no, our goal is to change what is. Economics is a moral philosophy. We have to focus on what ought to be. And so his goals are ethical values. So he really wanted to propose a political economy of biophysical equilibrium and moral growth. And I'll get back to the morality issue at the end of this talk. I think it's really, really important. His first thing was, his first goal for an ecological economy, he said, was sustainable scale. And where scale is the size of the economic system relative to the ecosystem that sustains it. And he stressed that as the economy grows, the first simple hunter-gatherers, we had food and clothing, incredibly high marginal utility, if you're struggling to get enough calories, an additional piece of food is immensely valuable. If you barely have enough clothes, like when Adam Smith wrote Wealth of Nations and said people should have at least 2 shirts, you should have at least a linen shirt, each additional unit of economic output is immensely valuable when you have very little. But as you get more and more and more, you start using it to buy less and less important things. Americans buy like 68 pieces of clothing a year on average, not including socks and underwear. Bigger and bigger flat screen TVs, housing sizes have doubled, since the 1970s. So each additional unit of economic product has less and less utility it provides. Yet, at the same time, the ecological costs are soaring. As you clear more and more forests, the Amazon apparently has reached a tipping point in some areas where the loss of the forest cover means rainfall that used to hit the canopy, filter down as a mist, be absorbed by the soil, evapotranspire and recycle and form new clouds and new rain and maintain that system. Now the water hits the bare ground, which is no longer aerated, flows out into the rivers, flushed from the system. The Amazon can no longer recycle enough rainfall to reproduce itself. And Herman stressed that, as we clear more forests, as we burn more fossil fuels, we have greater and greater disutilities from that. And at one point, those disutilities become catastrophic, like the planetary boundaries, climate change, phosphorus and nitrogen emissions. We're reaching this point where we risk catastrophic impacts. But as Herman said, so sustainable scale means we have to stay way away from these catastrophic boundaries. At some point, there's a futility boundary. where the marginal benefits we get from increasing the size of our economy are less than ecological costs. And at that point, we must stop growing. As Herman said, though, we shouldn't waste our time trying to identify some precise point. As he says that, if you're falling from a plane, it's better to have a parachute than an altimeter. And we don't want to waste time trying to get an altimeter. This is a, conceptual idea that on a finite planet where more and more of these life-sustaining ecological functions are destroyed by our economy, at some point it has to be the case that the economic benefits are less than the ecological costs. And we have to stop economic growth. And another thing Herman really liked, one of my favorite quotes of his, is that scale, the size of the economy relative to the ecosystem, is price determining, not price determined. He said markets cannot help us alone achieve sustainable scale. We need good science to understand what the sustainable scale is. We need to have ethics involved to think about how much of Earth's bounty should be captured by humans and how much left for other species. And Herman was explicit about this back in his 1968 article. So what we need to do is use science and ethics to determine scale and then impose that as a limit. The economy cannot go beyond there. We need to internalize the economy into nature rather than trying to internalize nature into the economy. And so I think this was very, very important. So it's, kind of his first priority in what an economy should try to achieve is sustainable scale so that future generations can continue. And if we have we care about future generations, it's a pretty weird ethical system that would care about the future and not the, conditions of the unborn. So Herman, also focused on just distribution within the generation. And he distinguished between wants and needs. And mainstream economics, this is just a quote from, I went through a whole bunch of mainstream economics textbooks. They all have a very similar quote. And it's this, that the law of demand puts the concept of basic human needs to rest, at least as an analytical concept. So the idea is from mainstream economics, there's no difference between wants and needs. And Elon Musk's casual whim to take a rocket ship to the moon or do whatever, or to, spend extravagantly on things. If he's willing to pay more for that than I'm willing to pay to feed my starving child, than some destitute mother is willing to pay to feed her starving child, then that's what the market should do. In fact, in the first edition of Paul Samuelson's textbook, he said, you may be aware that John D. Rockefeller feeds his dog a bowl of milk every morning, while children in New York are suffering from rickets because they can't afford milk. Is that a market failure? He says, no, that's the market doing what it's meant to do, allocating resources to those willing to pay the most. But Herman said, no, that's not. If that's what our economic system does, that's the wrong thing. We need to prioritize basic human needs over the luxury whims of the rich. So the mainstream said that, no, we've just got to focus on allocating resources to those who pay the most. This is Nobel laureate Robert Lucas, a quote from him about, distribution. He says, of the tendencies that are harmful to sound economics, the most seductive, and in my opinion, the most poisonous, is to focus on questions of distribution. So when Herman was pushing for us to pay more attention to distribution, it was not, this was really going against the grain. And nowadays, since Piketty this century has done a couple massive volumes on distribution, it's now become acceptable. But Herman was one of the pioneers, getting us to focus on this. And I think Herman would agree with me that, inequality is the greatest market failure. Markets allocate resources based on the current distribution of wealth and resources, and the resulting allocation, what we make is no better than the underlying distribution. So countries like the US, we invest a lot in yachts and slums, and countries like Norway invest in neither. So I really think distribution is one of the biggest, or inequality is one of the biggest market failures. And Here's a little bit of something what might seem jarring. Mostly when Herman would talk about human populations, which he was very concerned with overpopulation, he would talk about it under sustainable scale. We can't have more people than the planet can sustain. However, this has gotten, and many people who are concerned about population did make some kind of very racist comments, implying that it's those brown people in poor countries who are, having too many children. And it's not, so it's their, they really did try to blame the poor. But I think what Herman pointed out to me, which is very important, is what is the impact of population on the distribution of wealth? Um, and, there's this book called The Great Leveler that says the only time we have seen decreases in inequality is when populations have fallen, or when there's been massive catastrophes of other types, but usually a falling population. So when the Black Death wiped out 1/3 of Europe's population, suddenly land was in abundance and labor was scarce. It was this massive redistribution of power from the owners of capital and land to the workers. And this is what needs to happen again now. There was an article in the New York Times. I couldn't find the exact one. This isn't the one. It's but right now you'll see a lot of stuff where they're talking about the demographic crisis in China or the demographic crisis in Cuba, where populations aren't falling, are falling. And one of the articles in New York Times said, this is really going to have a negative impact on China's economic model, which is based on paying really low wages to people so they can sell a lot of exports. And if there's fewer people, they'll have to raise wages. That would be a terrible thing. No, that actually would be a wonderful thing. Right now that China relies on low wages so they can export huge amounts of cheap plastic crap to the US, that's perverse. If we have lower populations, and in the city I'm in right now, there's real estate prices have gone up like 50% in 3 years, and rent has as well. And and the big part of that actually is that we have excess demand, too many rich people buying up second homes, especially during COVID. But if you think about it, as soon as populations start to fall, what's going to happen to the value of real estate? The value of real estate is going to plunge. The value of capital is going to plunge relative to labor, because there will be, as the population falls, we way more capital per person. And this is going to be a huge redistribution of power. And it's a huge redistribution of power away from the owners of land and capital and assets. So I really think that we need to focus on population is a question of just distribution and a way to empower the poor. Still means the most overpopulated countries are the richest ones, because we have those metabolisms of the 30-ton gorilla. Poor people are in many poor countries, their ecological impacts are a tiny fraction of ours. But for the so basically for the welfare of the world, we should, or for the welfare of people in poor countries, you've got to deal with climate change. The rich countries should slash population. For the welfare of poor people, they would also benefit from reducing their population growth. So I really think it's the lowest income people that benefit the most from a demographic transition. And then Herman said the third goal is efficient allocation. And he looked to markets for this and is frequently criticized. There was, in fact, an article claiming that Herman's goals of a steady state economy were a Trojan horse for inserting neoclassical economics into ecological economics. And this really misses the point. Herman was very explicit that markets are totally incapable of achieving sustainable scale and totally incapable of achieving just distribution on their own. Those are determined by science and ethics outside the market. And we can only trust in markets once those questions have been determined. So markets are good for tastes and preferences. If everybody has enough money to meet their basic needs, well, then we can rely on a market to say, geez, I like broccoli better than I like cauliflower, or I like corn better than tomatoes. Allow the market, allow the individual to satisfy their tastes and preferences. And and markets are very good at that. And he's not talking about capitalist markets. He's not talking about ever increasing accumulation, but just using markets as a way for people to satisfy their distinct tastes and preferences, which is very distinct from basic needs. Basic needs have to be settled ahead of time. And the other quote I liked about Herman in terms of we often right now we're saying, oh, we need more efficient cars, electric cars, because that's going to solve the climate crisis. And as Herman pointed out, building on Jevons, frugality leads to efficiency, not vice versa. As we get more and more efficient cars, we just drove more and more miles and bought more and more cars. So we need frugality first. So Herman was a big advocate of cap and share systems or cap and trade systems, where the idea is that first, based on sustainable scale, we decide what are the ecological limits. In this case, maybe how much CO2 could be emitted into the atmosphere without causing runaway climate change. And to be realistic, we're so dependent on fossil fuels, we're going to initially we'd have to start a cap that's higher than the ecosystems can sustain. But as we get more and more experience, we can lower that cap and keep reducing the cap until it becomes sustainable. The problem is, though, if you have a system where we set a cap and like if we had a cap and auction, like we have in Vermont with greenhouse gases for electric companies, anytime you reduce the cap, prices are going to go up, and corporations are going to pass those prices on to consumers, and consumers are going to be, worse off. And if we have taxes, anytime you raise taxes, everybody's going to complain. So we need to gradually ratchet down the caps. How do we do that? We need political support. So Herman would say, well, we could put a cap on the amount of CO2. The next question is, who is entitled to that? Europe gave the right to pollute to the existing polluters. Vermont is saying, well, no, the right belongs to all of us. The state will auction it off. Another approach you could do is just give everybody in, let's say in the country, it's easier to do it at a national level, the right to a certain amount of CO2. And what we know about fossil fuels and other essential resources, they have extremely inelastic demand, meaning the less you have, the more revenue they generate. And so if we had, the same would be true for a cap on CO2 emissions. So if everybody had a cap, what would happen is that probably 90% of the country would sell a share of their cap to the richest 10%. And that would redistribute wealth from the rich to the poor, or rich to the less, to the poor too. I mean, but it would redistribute wealth downward. And this means every time we tighten a cap, the value of the cap, the revenue they generate would go up. So suddenly you would have 90% of the population saying, tighten that cap because that increases, the value to me, and it could create the political will to continually ratchet down our caps. And so, Herman's view is that first, this addresses sustainable scale, what we set the cap. Second, just distribution, who gets the cap. And third, efficient allocation, allow the market to reallocate, which would drain huge amounts of wealth from the rich to the poor. And if you didn't do that, I'd be okay actually with a cap where Elon Musk couldn't use any more than the homeless guys down in the park down the hill here. But I think that's less viable strategy. I want to finish up quickly here because I've already gone 45 minutes. So the other big thing that Herman did was, he came up with an index of sustainable economic welfare, which evolved into the genuine progress indicator. And so it was a big alternative to GDP, a way to measure things. Vermont's one of 2 states in the US that actually use GPI. But it was just new ways of measuring. This was really important. But I want to spend a few minutes here on my final conversation with Herman. We had phone conversations and email shortly before his death, and what we realized is that both of us, Herman's very religious, and I'm very much I'm an atheist, and very much believe in evolutionary theory. But Herman and I had very shared moral values, very shared goals. We had a shared vision for what we wanted to happen in the economy, for what we saw. So we had different views of where moral values came from, but we really shared our views on what they were. And Herman is religious. He really did see kind of our moral values as revealed, is decreed by God and revealed through religion. But his moral value and mine, we both agreed, is a good person puts the group ahead of the individual, and an evil person puts the individual ahead of the group. And Herman really believed that this was something that was bestowed on us by a creator. And Herman did have some, Herman really did believe that he believed in evolution, but he also believed in creation. I think there were some inconsistencies in his thought there, but he had that view, and I explained to him my view. And my view is that morality evolved, and it's a fundamental feature of evolution at all scales. There's this idea of a major evolutionary transition where organisms that could once survive on their own become so cooperative that they can only survive together. And so the very first eukaryotic cell, a cell with a nucleus, the basis of all complex life, it was a fusion of an archaean, which is a new domain of life, not plant, animal, fungus. It's an archaean, and a bacteria, another domain of life. And they fused to create the eukaryotic cell, where the bacteria provides the mitochondria and some of the organelles. The archaean had the cell wall, and it created together a eukaryotic cell. Our mitochondria can't survive without the rest of the cell. These two things became so collaborative, they could only survive as a whole. And then we had the unicellular animals that evolved into multicellular animals. One cell in your body cannot survive apart from your body. It's so dependent on the network interactions of wholes, the whole that it's been a major evolutionary transition. And humans, we're social animals. As I said earlier, we can't survive apart from each other. So individual humans have become so collective, they can't survive apart from each other. And the all of life, the whole network, it's a basic principle of ecological economics that no species can survive apart from the ecosystem that sustains us all. And so again, we only can survive as a collective. So this multi-level selection theory says that within groups, selfishness outcompetes altruism. So the selfish individual might get helped by others, not give anything in return. Therefore, I'm going to have more resources for my kids, and they're going to survive better. So within a group, the selfish individual often outcompetes the altruistic ones. But between groups, the altruistic groups outcompete the selfish groups. So if you live in a community with too many, you live in a society with too many selfish people, they don't help each other, that society is going to fail relative to societies where everybody is helping each other. And so this cooperation is a fundamental driving feature of evolution. And what we've learned also is that selfishness at one scale reduces fitness at higher scales. So a selfish cell that only focuses on its own reproduction is a cancer. A selfish individual that cares about only themselves and not society is a sociopath. And a selfish species that just, grows inexorably without any, encroaching on the ecosystem is a plague species and goes extinct. And my view is that, as Herman pointed out, humans, we evolve through culture. And what holds us together is, is our ability to cooperate, our shared values. Anthropologists have studied moral values across cultures and found the one universal moral value is to put the group ahead of the individual and to cooperate. This is a universal moral value I believe evolved. Herman Daly believed was, moral values were, decreed by God essentially, but it didn't matter. We both agreed on what the implications were. And this is what I most loved about Herman is we could have very, very different views. We could talk and he would listen intelligently and share his views, listen to mine. I would do the same with him. Easy to find shared ground. Herman was always deeply curious, always interested in new ideas. And like him, I would not want to live in an echo chamber where everybody agrees with me. Ecological economics needs to maintain that vitality, that difference of views, but with respect for each other, and to continue to build our vision of the new of a way the world works. And I say that here we are in 2024. What Herman has managed to achieve in those intervening years, I really think we are poised for a massive paradigm shift within the field of economics. Herman was, really launched that, was one of the pioneers. I realized I went on for longer than I expected. I want to save time for questions, and I apologize for the almost hour-long monologue. So I'd like to open the floor, and I think I'll just stop sharing now.
No, thank you. That was great. We learned a lot, at least I did. And I'm glad you ended your talk on that one point of not being an echo chamber. And, one thing that's bothered me with ecological economics as a whole is some of the groups that have broken away from, let's say, the U.S. Society or International Society. And I understand some of the reasonings behind it, but I think we're stronger as a group when we have diverse thoughts and ability to argue and strengthen our arguments with each other than siloing. And so thank you for especially that last piece. So we have a couple questions already in the chat, and if you want to, you can certainly raise your hand, but we'll start with this one. Alejandro asks, could the work of Herman and Eleanor Ostrom be harmonized, considering they seldom cited each other? What's your perspective on this potential alignment?
Oh yeah, no, I think for sure. And interestingly, so Herman was very much interested in the commons, and I think he knew of and respected the work of Lynn Ostrom. I mentioned multi-level selection theory, and this idea that the selfish individuals outcompete other individuals within a group, and cooperative groups outcompete other groups. And one of the leaders in that field was David Sloan Wilson, and he actually worked with Lynn Ostrom and concluded that the two together concluded that her 8 core principles for building the commons were identical to the 8 core principles for successful cooperation that have been driving evolutionary history. So that there is this huge overlap. And Herman was very much, a very strong believer in many of his writings. He believed that the wealth of nature should belong to all of us collectively. Totally. So, he believed that wealth created by nature or by society as a whole must be part of the commons. And some of these things, Lynn Ostrom primarily focused on common pool resources, which are rival but non-excludable until you create a social way of excluding them, which is the commons. Herman was also deeply interested in the knowledge commons, and knowledge improves through use, so it's radically different. He wrote quite a bit about the fact that knowledge based on its the fact that it's collectively created by all of us, and the fact that it improves through use. For a justice reason, because it's created by all of us, it should be collectively owned. And for an efficiency perspective, it should also be collectively owned, because the biggest input into new knowledge is existing knowledge, and when we privatize and enclose that commons, it slows the advance of knowledge. So I think absolutely, I see I see complete complementarity between Ostrom and Daly.
Next, we have Lisi. Go ahead.
Gotta
Hi,
unmute him.
Josh. Thanks so much for that presentation. I appreciate it. As you know, you and I don't always agree on everything about Herman. And I have a couple of specific sort of questions or elaborations, perhaps just opening to a larger discussion, which doesn't necessarily have to take place here, about Herman and his kind of notion of objective value and his tendencies towards creationism. He did clearly believe that humans are created differently than other species, that we are created in the image and likeness of God. And that influenced his notion, and I think the centrality of his view that objective value is important. It is kind of the moral foundation. And that is what catapults us to change. So I think I've summarized kind of his connection there. I guess I've been kind of disturbed by his anti-materialist, anti-evolutionary perspective. And I've been disturbed by it because I think there's kind of two different levels of things as ecological economists that we have to consider. One is we do want to make change. We want to try to make change. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that we want to do is that we want to really understand how we come to be what we come to be in relation to Earth. Mm-hmm. You know, that seems to me kind of an overarching goal of ecological economics. And I guess it's in this last sense that I have some real problems with Herman, because his sort of notion of objective value and making change definitely puts him at odds with the what he called the neo-Darwinists, and put him at odds with the materialism as it is kind of, it begins to be developed in Marx. Okay, he was at odds with that. And I guess for me, I think that that had a profound influence on the way ecological economics has developed. And I think ecological economics over time has moved away from trying to understand the complexity of the evolution of humans in relation to Earth. And that puts us in kind of an odd situation right now, because when I look out, I see a lot of determinism in what I see. I mean, we appear to be caught up in an economic system that we can't measurably change. We are unable to measurably change. And yet in the discourse of ecological economics, perhaps because we've moved away from materialism and foundational kind of evolutionary thinking, we don't have a way to think about that very well. And so I'm throwing that out to asking if you'll make some comments about that.
Yeah. So I have a lot of comments on that, actually. So first of all, Herman and I, Herman totally acknowledges, he did believe, I think he believed, I'm not very religious. We didn't discuss this in detail. I think he believes humans were created in God's image, and that evolution doesn't apply to us like it does to the rest of humanity, rest of creation. But he does talk a lot about, you read throughout his work, he does talk about other species evolving. And he says that humans evolve through culture. And I am totally with that. I think that the biological evolution happens at a very slow rate. Even most of our biological evolution that is still occurring was driven by culture first, like getting shorter guts because we developed fire. So I think regardless of what we believe about creationism, we both accepted, we accepted evolution, cultural evolution, and that's where things are going to come. Your point about things being too deterministic, that we can't have any power to make change, then what's the point? if I believe that fully, I just quit my job and go do whatever. Because, as Herman said, it was a deep contradiction for people to be struggling. And I look at you as trying to change the world in a better way. And yet what you're saying is the system is so deterministic, we can't. And to some extent, I have problems with the neo-Darwinists too. Like I love Robert Sapolsky. I think he's a genius. He has brilliant ideas, been a big influence on me. But his latest book, Determinism, or Determined, I think it's called, he argues that it's a very biologically deterministic perspective, that our genes are so much in control of what we do, that we have no free will. And he kind of poo-poos the multi-level selection theory and the role of cultural evolution. Whereas I look at, the fact that we have probably the biggest drives are reproduction and safety. And yet through culture, we'll have people go sacrifice themselves for others in war, and people refuse to breed. So I think culture is incredibly powerful, and we can fundamentally change our culture. I actually think that, social media, for example, gives us a possibility for changing culture at an unbelievably fast rate across the world. Perversely, we have decided we're going to put it in the hands of the private sector, where its driving focus is like, let's get people to stay on longer so they're exposed to more ads, so it stimulates consumerism. And the way to do that is to use polarizing algorithms that polarize, they keep you on longer by polarizing you. So where we need greater cohesion and cooperation and less consumerism, we've taken the most powerful tool at our disposal for changing the world to do exactly the opposite. In my view, we put it in the hands of sociopaths who put their profit over anything. So I think that because Herman was very explicitly agreed with cultural evolution, and I don't think any of us really think that the solution to our problems is going to be genetic evolution. I mean, we could, use CRISPR-Cas9 to do a gene drive to make us all really, really tiny, and then we have a lower ecological impact. But come on, that's I really think that Herman totally convinced me that I used to be a bit more of a scientific materialist and a determinist. And he convinced me that is, I have no business being an ecological economist if I really believe we couldn't change the system. And I fundamentally believe we can, and it's going to be hard, but I think he's made a lot of taking the first steps to helping us do it.
I don't
And
want to.
with Lizzie, I'm a big, I was going to say, I agree. You and I we very much have very shared views on evolution.
Except in this sense, and let me and I don't want to dominate the conversation here, but I do want to follow up with this.
Well, please make it quick because we got a couple.
Yeah, John and I did a lot of work on the kind of similarities between the evolution of ant colonies that practice agriculture and humans. That opened up the question in my mind of what are the boundaries of culture and what is culture, okay? And what is not culture. And so I think in the complexity of thinking about economic systems, we tend to use culture as a catch-all thing for describing our economic system, when in fact, it might be a much more complicated evolutionary process and dynamic than is captured by culture. It is not simply cultural. And I think that
it's symbolic. It's not genetic, it's symbolic evolution.
Well, I mean, I'm just throwing that out. That's a point of conversation that I think is probably worth having. Thanks, Josh.
Sure. Yeah.
Next is Liam.
Liam.
Hi, Dr. Farley. It's so good to see you.
Good to see you, Liam.
Wonderful devotion to Herman and his ideas, by the way. I can say you carry on his legacy and how you do your research, and also how you parent your students as he did for you. So I'm personally grateful for that, and feel like I'm developing something similar with you. So thank you. But my question is somewhat similar to Dr. Krall's, but instead of focusing on the economic determinism of the human predicament, looking more at some of the cognitive underpinnings. So I was curious how compatible or discordant the major evolutionary transition perspective of the social system is, which you kind of alluded to. Maybe you and Herman disagreed on some of the source of those cooperative tendencies, but both were pretty convergent on the tenets. How compatible or discordant is that with the nativist view that I know William Rees, for example, is a huge exponent of, that argues that unsustainability is a natural derivative of the cognitive predispositions that lead to dissonance and collective denial, that when combined with the case species characteristics of humans in a techno-industrialist society, cause overshoot. And he kind of even dismisses some of the ethnographic record, looking at small-scale societies that have persisted. He's arguing that there is this emergent property that all of these variables in tandem somewhat makes sustainability a pipe dream in the time frame that it's needed. So I was just wondering what your perspective is on the compatibility of those, if there's room for agreement, and whether or not you do believe that the impasse is insurmountable.
Yeah. So, I think a lot of this, getting back to the idea of multi-level selection theory, where the individual, the individual should act for the benefit of the group. So the cell in my body, I do not want to be focused on its own self-interest. I want it to be focused on the interest of my body. So like ecosystem services, the role of that cell in sustaining me. And I think it's analogous that the humans and many traditional cultures apparently had this philosophy that, that people saw themselves as part of a complex system, and that they depended on that system, and all the livelihood they derived from that system was like a gift from nature for which they were obliged to reciprocate. And I think they saw themselves as having the same relationship to nature that I see ourselves as having to us, where they would take the minimum necessary and give back as much as possible. And that probably Bill Rees would say, well, what works for a tribe of 1,000 or a band of 400 is not going to work for a group of 8 billion. And I totally agree. But both Herman very much agreed that humans were part of this collective biosphere, and you couldn't separate us from it. And that relationship of, needing to focus on the whole, and not just the individual, because what's the whole and the individual, changes by scale. When it comes to the ecosystem, the species is the individual and the ecosystem's the whole. So I think that, he did believe we needed to change our focus and not just focus on the human system, but focus on the whole encompassing ecosystem. And so I think that, we don't know, I don't think we can go back to the ethnographic record and see how they did it and do the same. We have to adapt things to our vastly larger scale. So I don't know, Liam, if that actually answered your question sufficiently, but you can always follow up on email too, or whatever.
No, thank you so much. You touched on a lot of the points. I appreciate it.
There's a question in the chat from Irwin. How could an economy-wide cap be implemented?
So this is the thing. How can it? So, I mentioned the neoliberal revolution starting in the 1970s, and since then, and I should start out too. What I always do is, some of you have heard this before, but I always ask my students, what kind of economic system are you raised in? And everybody says, oh, I was raised in a neoliberal capitalist market system, or something along those lines. And I say, oh, your parents charge you room and board? And the fact is that most of our lives, we are not in a capitalist system. A lot of us are university professors. And every time you do any more than the minimum you need to do, it's voluntary, and you review papers for others, you write more papers than you need to, you give presentations, all of this stuff, you do it because you think it's the right thing to do. You feel a moral obligation to do it. So most of my job, I'm not doing it as part of a market economy. I'm doing it as part of a moral economy. Just before signing on, I accepted a paper review for ecological economics, and I'm not getting paid. It's the right thing to do. And so we are deeply embedded in what I would call the core economy, which is about the reciprocity and gifting and our interrelationships with each other. Starting in the 1970s, we became obsessed with this idea of forcing everything into the market economy in many very perverse ways. And so I think we've got to get rid of this idea, which Herman helped do, get rid of this obsession with markets, is and realize that there's many, many ways we can allocate resources that are, and I think that our relationship with nature, we have to, try to put that back into that core economy, a relationship of reciprocity and gifting. And, we talk about ecosystem services. We define it as nature's benefits to people. And in my view, that would be like a cell thinking about ecosystem services, saying, oh, what's the body's benefit to me? Totally the wrong way to think about it. And I think we can kind of change this philosophy to focus on, nature is the system that sustains us all, and we've got to treat correctly. And it's part of that, getting away from that Cartesian dualism. So Herman, right in his 1968 book, recognizes, despite his religious background, where he really did believe humans were in some way distinct, when it came to our relationship to the rest of nature, he acknowledged that, we are absolutely dependent on that, what he would call creation. So the ways to do it, I mean, I hinted at this a little bit, that I actually think that if we took social media and instead of having algorithms designed to get us to buy more stuff and hate each other, we had algorithms that focused on, getting us to understand our relationship to each other and to nature, and just changing the knowledge we're exposed to. I think it could have a profound impact on our moral values. And I guess this gets back to some of the things I talked about earlier. In Garrett Hardin's article on the tragedy of the commons, the epigraph, and I'm paraphrasing it slightly, he was talking about population, but population is a social dilemma in his phrasing. Social dilemmas have no technological solution. They require a fundamental extension of morality. I think our relationship with nature is a social dilemma. For any human or any group of humans, we get all the benefits from burning that fossil fuels, chopping down those forests. We get them for ourselves and share the cost with everybody else. When everybody acts in their own individual self-interest, it creates that common, that invisible foot that kicks the common good in the ass. And we really need to we need a fundamental extension of morality. And I believe that morals evolved, and that they evolved to allow us to cooperate at larger and larger scales. And that's where we need to go. Very difficult to say concretely how to do that. Some of the experts in multi-level selection theory have proposed these 8 core principles for successful cooperation that they claim can be applied at any scale, all the way up to the relationship between humans and the rest of nature. And so that's what I'm exploring now, but I don't consider myself an expert enough to, give concrete arguments on how to do that. I'll super quickly, we're doing a project here, and I just started a new grant I got doing a course on urban agroecology, where we want people to change the way they manage their lawns away from turf grass, which is the most abundant crop in America, takes 10 times the chemicals of other crops. We want people to start focusing on managing their land for the benefit of society and nature as a whole, which is a fundamental extension of morality. It's not a technical solution. To get people to manage their yards like that has to get them to rethink their relationship to land, to society, and to nature. So these are some of the things I'm playing with, and I don't know. I think we got to try a million things and see what works. An evolutionary perspective, try everything, and what achieves our goals of a socially just sustainability transition, improve, and what doesn't achieve those goals, reject and try something new.
Are there any other questions? Okay, I don't see any. Josh, do you have any last comments that you'd like to make?
I guess just an expression of deep gratitude for Herman, a real suffering over his loss, I think, for our whole community. And I have seen there has been like kind of attacks on Herman for various of his views. And what I loved about him, whenever he was attacked, he would just, respond in the most pleasant ways and listen carefully to what others had to say. I really think that's kind of a role model for how we have to move forward as an ecological economics community, that there is power and strength. Or I mean, there is power in numbers, strength in numbers. We should focus more on the overwhelming extent of common ground we have. And too often we spend quibbling over little details. So, you know, there was that article, which was actually a pretty good article. Most of the things in it I agreed with. It was, saying that steady state economics was a Trojan horse. I disagreed with that. I agreed with the critiques of of mainstream economics. I saw that person as my natural ally, not as my enemy. But my response to the article was called Circular Firing Squads. And I think this was in response to Che Guevara was asked about the American left. And he said, it's just like circular firing squads. They all get around each other and, shoot at each other. Whereas I've seen the right and mainstream economists, they're in lockstep unison, and we're more busy fighting among ourselves, the folks we agree with 95% of things, about that 5% we disagree. And I don't think that's the right way to go.
Well said. So thank you. I want to thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to do this. We really do appreciate it, and can't thank you enough for doing that. And one last thing, I just want to put in a plug for our conference coming up June 6th through the 9th. You can find information on the U.S. Society webpage, and hopefully we'll see many of you there.
Right. And thanks for inviting me for this, and thanks for making Herman, putting this effort into maintaining, keeping Herman alive. So
That's important. So
yeah,
thank you very much.
All right. See y'all. Thanks all for taking your time to share your lunch with me.